All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Atkins. I'm the Assistant Director of the Kennebunk Free Library. Thank you all for joining us for the second program in a six-part series about Maine's Climate Action Plan. We have a bunch of speakers. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions. You're all going to remain muted, so just put your questions in the chat and somebody will read them to the presenters. If you're not familiar with chat, I know we've all been doing a lot of Zoom, but if you just hover over the bottom of the screen and hit there's a little button that says chat. If you hit on that, it'll bring up a chat box and you can just type in there. So I'm going to turn you over to Jen from the Planeteers.
Thank you, Allison. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Armstrong, and I'm a member of the Planeteers of Southern Maine. We are a grassroots environmental group located in the Kennebunks. Our organization is acting to stem the tide of climate change while promoting sustainable living and protecting the creatures, contours, and climate of Mother Earth. We Planeteers of Southern Maine organize both Planet Talks and Planet Walks in an effort to invite people to come together to work on creating new and more sustainable lives. We are nonpartisan, and we hope that everyone joining us recognizes that they have something to offer and a unique role to play in the change making. Our walks include community cleanups and monthly beach erosion monitoring in conjunction with UME and Maine Sea Grant, a program that you'll hear more about in our exciting final session on Tuesday, May 18th. We report our findings on our social media platforms, as well as to Maine Sea Grant, NOAA, the Ocean Conservancy, World Oceans Day, and Gaia. Our talks have included regenerative and backyard farming, the importance of planting and building for pollinators, seeding native and wildflowers, carbon emissions and sequestration, sea level rise, marine debris, bioplastics, PFAS, and toxicity of plastics. All of these topics will be revisited in the April sessions, which deal with the Maine Climate Action Plan sectors of land use, energy, transportation, and building and infrastructure. I'm happy to say that thanks to popular demand, some of the presenters who've joined us in the past will serve as panelists again. Sometimes we walk and talk. In 2019, prior to COVID, we visited with area restaurants, 50 in the Kennebunks alone, to explore greening practices, specifically deplasticizing. We were excited to learn not only that most were holding internal meetings to discuss better practices, but that many are already taking steps to improve their environmental impact. This effort and a related one underway at the Rachel Carson Wildlife Refuge will be discussed in our session on Tuesday, May 4th. Instead of organizing a celebration for Earth and science this year, we've done it as we have done in years past prior to the pandemic. We are thrilled to be rolling out this series of Planet Talks. Thrilled because we have Maine's Climate Action Plan as a blueprint. Thrilled with the experts joining us tonight. Thrilled to have our library partner with us in this project, and thrilled to have you all here. We hope you find tonight's session meaningful and that you will join us again next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Also, because everyone can be a Planeteer, please consider joining us. I would also like to encourage you all to get involved in the legislative process by contacting your state legislators about your concerns. Please feel free to reach out if you need help taking the first step. Finally, and because we are grassroots, I'd like to mention that yes, we do accept donations. Thanks to Lodholm Trust, who serves as our fiscal sponsor, we are now able to offer you an easy means by which to support us. Where to go here? On our website is someplaneteers.org. You have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page to find the button, but it's down at the bottom there. And on our Facebook page, out at Some Planeteers. There's a donation link in the About Us section on our Facebook page. And Allison is going to put those links in the chat for you. Great, I'm so glad that all of you are here tonight. I'm so excited to hear what our presenters have to say. First up, we have Sarah Simon from the Maine Farmland Trust. Sarah works with Maine Farmland Trust as the Farm Viability and Farmland Access Director. She manages programs that help farmers access land, run profitable businesses, and restore and protect the health of their soils. Before beginning in this role last May, she was the director of a community farm and food access organization in New York's Hudson Valley. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Jen. And thank you so much for having me. I think this is such a wonderful event, and I'm so excited to hear from the other panelists who work across different areas of land use. I think it's so important to talk about all of it all together. The forests, farms, gardens, it's all related and it all is really important. So I'm gonna share my screen here and just give a little bit of an introduction to what we'll be talking about today. So I work for Maine Farmland Trust, as Jen mentioned. Maine Farmland Trust is a statewide organization that protects farmland, supports farmers, and advances the future of farmland. And many people know us for our farmland protection work, but as Jen mentioned, my role is a little different. And I sometimes describe our farm viability work as the various ways that we try to meet all the other needs that farmers have once they've placed an easement to make sure their land will stay farming forever, because forever is a very long time. And so for that reason, we help farmers with business planning. We help them find and access new farmland when they need it. We help create a more vibrant local food economy. And recently, we have also shifted to focus more on helping farmers adapt to and mitigate climate change. So I will talk more about that later on. I'll have a little bit of extra time to share more of what we're doing. But to get us started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the role that natural and working lands play in relation to climate change. And I suspect I'm preaching to the choir here, but for any of you who are new to this, one of the really fascinating aspects of the way that our natural and working lands influence our impact on the climate is that they both can be ways of sequestering carbon, and certainly in a state like Maine with so much forested land in particular, there's a lot of important carbon sequestration happening, but they also can involve a lot of emissions as well, and those emissions can be reduced. And so both of those practices and aspects of the way we use our natural lands have come to have this name, natural climate solutions. And so I'm going to use this term, and perhaps the other presenters will too. This term started being used around the last 5 years and has been used in a couple scientific papers. And so I'm pulling this definition from one from 2016, which is conservation, restoration, and/or improved land management actions that increase carbon storage and/or avoid greenhouse gas emissions across global forests, wetlands, grasslands, and agricultural lands. So this title, Natural Climate Solutions, is really a nod to the fact that there's potential on both sides of the issue, both to increase carbon sequestration and decrease emissions in the ways that we're using our natural and working lands. And so in agriculture, there are a lot of practices that often do both of these things, such as reducing tillage and the turning over of soil, which releases carbon into the atmosphere, increased use of cover cropping, manure management, the use of biochar as a soil amendment, simply preventing land that is currently in grassland or farmland from being converted to real estate development, which of course is central to what the Farmland Trust works on, better management of riparian zones and wetlands, and agroforestry, integrating woody plants into annual agricultural production. And so the Natural and Working Lands Working Group was part of the process of coming up with the Climate Action Plan. As many of you know, it was one of these 6 committees, and Maine Farmland Trust's Policy and Research Director, Ellen Griswold, was fortunate to be part of that group and to put forward some recommendations for how we can do better using the natural climate solutions we have available in Maine. And so I'm just going to go over some of the agriculture strategies, which I'm sure many of you have read, but just to review some of the areas where we think there's the most potential to see a change. and what we've recommended to the state to consider. So first is financial incentives. Especially in agriculture, we're hopeful that the adoption of these practices will have a long-term benefit generally to soil health, but also in turn a financial benefit for farmers. But it does take time to make change and to get there. And so in the interim, we feel financial incentives are really important to help support farmers, foresters, others to make a transition to more sustainable practices. The next recommendation is for increased technical assistance, making more resources available, more experts to advise communities, farmers, loggers, and foresters who want to make these changes and shift to more sustainable practices. There's a bullet for research, really supporting University of Maine to continue being on the forefront of all of these natural land-related climate concerns. And there's an emphasis on land conservation as well, increasing by 2030 the total acreage of conserved lands in the state to 30%, which would be really significant. And I just want to underscore, at Maine Farmland Trust, we talk a lot about the importance of conserving farms for the food, for their role in communities, for supporting small businesses. But this is a really important dimension of land conservation, that it actually plays a role in mitigating climate change by keeping land in its carbon sequestering, plant growing form, rather than constructing buildings on it, which not only emits a lot of carbon in the construction process, but over the life cycle of the building, the ongoing heating and other emissions causing normal parts of a human dwelling really emit a lot of carbon too. So land conservation is a really important climate change mitigation strategy. There's a goal for local food production and consumption, increasing to 30% by 2030. And finally, and I think really importantly, more urgently, by 2022, there's the goal of developing better policies to balance solar siting with the need to preserve natural and working lands, which we've seen at Maine Farmland Trust is so important because solar development is critical to move to a clean energy economy, and yet we don't want to lose our prime farmlands in that effort. So it's really important to have both and to balance them. And I believe the legislature is currently in the process of approving the convening of a working group to consider exactly that issue. And we hope there will be farmers on that working group. So that's just a little introduction to what we know about what's in the Climate Action Plan as it impacts and relates to natural and working lands in the state. And I'll get to talk more later about what we're doing at Maine Farmland Trust, but I will stop my share for now and turn it back to Jen or Tom to go to the next person.
I don't see any questions just yet. So so our next speaker will be Noah Wentworth from Frinklepod Farm. Jen, do you have Noah's bio?
Yes, I do. Okay. Next up, like Tom said, is Noah Wentworth. We're so psyched to have him here tonight as well. He is the co-owner of Frinklepod Farm in Rundle with Flora Brown, where he's been cultivating an intense, ecologically diverse food production system for 10 years. Frinklepod Farm engages with the local community by offering resources, conversation, plants, and produce on a path to more localized, sustainable farms and backyards. Founder of Evergreen Building Collaborative, Noah has been designing and building energy efficient net zero solar homes for 25 years. Welcome, Noah. Thanks for being here.
It's quite a mouthful, Jen. Well, thanks to the Planeteers and their partners for putting this program together and inviting me. Sarah did a great job at introducing the concepts around agriculture and the potential that agriculture has in the sequestration of carbon, and as a important element to stemming climate change. And I think obviously not all farming methods are alike, and so I think Sarah also alluded to the methods of farming and food production and how we utilize land does have negative impacts as well. And so it's important to think about, what kind of agriculture are we promoting in our communities, and how to support regenerative forms of agriculture. So, I guess I'll just introduce my story a little bit in that, as Jen mentioned, I, spent quite a few years designing and building energy efficient net zero homes. And I think I sort of came to a point in those efforts where I felt like I was, spending a lot of time trying to please clients in their efforts to make a dream home for themselves. But I was, having growing concerns about whether I was really making the kind of impact on the planet that I really wanted to have. And having grown up on a self-sustaining farm and being involved in agriculture and perennial landscape design, I have always been drawn to agriculture as a career. And so 11 years ago, when Flora, my wife, and I had an opportunity to buy some land and really commit to farming, I felt like it was important to make that transition, as an opportunity to do something that I felt like actually was giving back to the earth rather than taking. And I know for all of us who are very concerned about climate change and what are the strategies that we have in front of us, and what choices do we have in our daily lives that can really make an impact, it can be quite frustrating to find careers, find our path to really do things that we feel are making the kind of impact that we must make and really need to make. So, I came to this conclusion that farming, really did have this potential for me personally to do something that was giving back. But with that said, just having a piece of land and, employing fairly typical production methods, meaning that you're tilling the land, each spring, you're using methods that, may not be organic. You may be doing a lot more kind of monocropping in order to, meet certain market demands. So there's a lot of, agricultural methods that can lead you down a path where you actually are continuing to do more harm than good. But at the same time, finding models that are economically viable, that are also regenerative, is hard to find as well. So I think for us, fortunately, having a small plot of land at Frinklepod, which we really only grow on 4 acres, allowed us to develop a farming method that was much more, hands-on, hand tools, and kind of working the land in a way that, where we really didn't have to do much tillage, and really started to develop a agricultural system that I think is, meets that criteria for a regenerative production. So, specifically what that looks like is our system is basically permanent raised beds where we don't take the tiller, onto those beds and turn it over each year. We use a lot of leaf mulch, which, is really mimicking what happens in a forest ecosystem each year, where trees are sort of digging deep into the soil and drawing up really diverse minerals and nutrients and converting that into biomass, and then redepositing that on the surface, which then feeds soil microorganisms and breaks down that organic matter into a form that the tree and its surrounding plant species can really take up and utilize again. So that sort of cyclical process that happens in the forest, we sort of recreate in our agricultural landscape. And so, soil really has more potential than the biomass, above the soil to sequester carbon and hold that carbon. But obviously, if we're tilling and disturbing that soil each year, then we're letting a lot of that sequestered carbon back out into the atmosphere. And seasonally, you can really see on a global scale when it comes time in the spring for farms to start their tillage and prepare for crop planting, the amount of carbon that's released during that time frame is really dramatic. So, obviously we have a long ways to go in terms of a broader, more industrial kind of agricultural conversion to more regenerative methods. But even on larger scales, there are really hopeful signs that that's a possibility. But that's not our farm. So I think, for us, having a community scale farm where we get to really interact with our customer base and be able to sort of explain and talk through our methods and have people really, embrace kind of what the scale of agriculture that we do can provide for climate change is really rewarding, and part of why I continue to really believe in the farm that we run and its interaction with our community. So I think a couple other things that really relate to the kind of communities that we actually live in and how we might make choices in our own communities. I'm certainly an advocate of organizations like Maine Farmland Trust and really going for the larger land parcels to try to preserve. I mean, that obviously makes sense. If there's an opportunity to preserve 100 acres versus 3 or 4 acres, then we really need to prioritize that. But I will say that smaller scale farms, that are going on in Maine and across the country and really across the world, have proven to be both very viable economically and are much more geared towards a regenerative type of agriculture. So I think it's important to not overlook the value of just within our own communities, 1, 2, 3 or 4 acre parcels that are within our towns, within our suburbs, and the opportunity that has for both young farmers to get into farming on a smaller scale, but also I think it's hard for a 300 acre farm or bigger to really employ regenerative agriculture methods and not have to go through the cycle of tillage and so on. So I really encourage the conversation for that potential of really small scale agriculture right within our towns and suburbs. And one thing that Frinklepod is trying to work imagine is property that might be combined with housing where we're working on a piece of property right now where we're going to do a couple of housing units just because of the price of property around here makes it very difficult to buy it just for farming. But by building a couple, small houses that are done as condominiums, and the farm is part of a condo type association with the residents of those buildings, then we can look at ways to both, meet the demand for housing and also preserve, farmland and actively have agriculture going on, right within our residential developments. So I'm hopeful in the next year that, examples like that might take hold in other communities. So I'm guessing I'm probably fairly close to my 4-minute time frame. So thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Cynthia Walker. And she is, Cynthia had an emergency tonight and she wasn't able to make it, but she was so kind as to record her presentation for us. So we are going to play that for you, but I'd like to give you a little intro so you know who she is. She is the executive director of the Brick Store Museum in Kennebunk. She earned a BS in Public History and Middle Eastern Studies at Northeastern University and earned an MA in History Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, SUNY. Cynthia oversees the daily operations of the museum, including fundraising, programs, exhibitions, facilities management, and creating meaningful partnerships. Her favorite part of this work is sharing stories in thousands of ways.
Bear with me as I get this up here.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Walker, and I want to thank everyone for allowing me to join you tonight. I'm going to try to give a very brief overview of where Victory Gardens came from, how they were used, and then finish with how history can be a roadmap for how these gardens can be used in the fight for our climate. So let me just share my screen here, and then we can get going with the presentation. Okay, so this is one of my favorite sayings, and we'll come back to it once we get to the climate change portion, because I think it's a good saying for nowadays as well. I want to make sure folks know about our digital learning center on brickstoremuseum.org, which has a huge victory gardening page there, which goes deeper into topics I'll mention today, complete with 1940s victory garden plans if you want to copy something from history, recipes, and a lot of different activities that you can try. Families in the 1940s were active participants in the war. Food and other materials were supporting the 18 million American troops. So with more food going overseas, everyone had to make their meals kind of stretch. So citizens in Kennebunk and throughout the nation were encouraged to install victory gardens in their backyards to supplement rationed goods. That meant whatever you grew, you could keep. Although victory gardens are usually associated with World War II, they actually started during World War I. But it really wasn't until the 1940s that they became immensely popular. You can see on the screen here a grouping of US propaganda posters encouraging folks to plant a victory garden. In fact, at their peak, there were more than 20 million victory gardens planted across the United States. By 1944, more than 40% of vegetables grown in the United States were grown in a victory garden. Even those that didn't have backyard space would grow them on a porch or in a window box. Schools around the country grew victory gardens to use the produce in their school lunches. Growing your own vegetables at home, much like today, also helps to reduce food transportation costs and needs and use of rationed gasoline and tire rubber. Gardens across the United States grew a large variety of vegetables like tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, beets, peas, beans, corn, everything that we know today. Swiss chard and kohlrabi were introduced during the 1940s. At this juncture because they were very easy to grow. Succession planting was also something that was important. You can see on the screen here, there's a map of someone planting their garden in the 1940s. Victory gardeners produced over 10 billion pounds of food in 1943 alone, over 1/3 of all fresh vegetables in the country. So victory gardening for climate change, this is where that use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without saying comes from. I think certainly could be a saying for our climate change work. Throughout the United States, we have 40 million acres of green lawns. Our food system as it operates now contributes to up to 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. So imagine if we took over those lawns with vegetable gardens. Lawns sequester very little carbon, while gardens and other growth use the sun's energy to turn carbon into the sugars they need to grow. Not to mention, you get to grow food for your family and other community members if you want to donate it. If you visited the museum recently, these are a couple of pictures from last year. You may have noticed that about 50% of the lawns on our downtown campus have been converted to victory gardens as of 2021, with more conversion planned for the future. Climate change gardening also has to do with care for the earth. That means using compost, encouraging biodiversity, and rotating plants every year so the soil doesn't get depleted. It becomes sort of fun actually, because you get to challenge yourself with something new every year. There are so many benefits to having a garden, whether it be reducing your carbon footprint, growing your own food for you or your community, and exploring our shared past through the exploration of food history. You can really actually delve into the cultural pathways of European settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved peoples through the food that you grow. Lastly, here's our website again, so you can learn more about the Victory Gardening programming coming up, which we run all year. I also wanted to make special mention here of something called the Foodscapes Garden Project, which provides food insecure households in Maine with free materials to build their own raised bed vegetable gardens. You can find out more about this program as well as other resources on gardening and climate change resources on our website. So thank you so much for joining me and joining this program this evening, and I'll see you soon at the museum.
Thanks for that, Allison. Next up, we have Sarah Stanley. Sarah Stanley is the Executive Director of the Kennebunk Land Trust, a registered Maine guide. She is certified in CPR and Wilderness First Aid. Prior to the Kennebunk Land Trust, she worked with Maine State Parks, NOAA, and the University of Maine at Machias. She's a member of the Maine Audubon Board of Trustees. Sarah earned her BA in Environmental Studies and Politics from Bates College and an MS in Environmental Studies and Sustainability from Unity College. We're so glad to have you here tonight, Sarah.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Jen. I want to first thank the Planeteers and the library for inviting the Land Trust to this program, and it's been a pleasure so far hearing from the presenters so far, and I'm excited that we've got so many unique partners here involved. So thank you so much. Allison, I think I can manage the screen share, so I'm going to give it a shot here. Let me know if that works for everyone, and I'm going to get myself to the start here. So I just want to, when I spoke to Tom, he mentioned the idea of focusing a little bit more on forests. And so this presentation will focus a little bit more on forests, and I wanted to take more of a local look as well as a statewide look at our forests. So we'll highlight a little bit of Kennebunk and then a little bit of the state of Maine with this. So I want to just begin by talking about community conservation. So people who may be zooming in today from Kennebunk or the surrounding community know that Kennebunk has many great open spaces that are ecologically diverse. The Land Trust, the mission of the Kennebunk Land Trust, we're a membership organization, small nonprofit land trust, but we've protected over 3,400 acres of land throughout our 49-year history. And that includes 1,600 acres of the Kennebunk Plains. But the plains are now managed by Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife because they require a lot more expertise and controlled burns and those sort of things. But so there's great open space here, and none of that space could be protected without the support of many different community partners, whether they're local land trusts, individual people and families, a whole host of conservation organizations and partners there. And I want to highlight that brings me to my point of highlighting the real importance I find in community conservation about working together and collaboratively rather than in silos. I think, we've got so many great people and organizations working on different conservation issues and environmental issues and climate change. And as we partner together, like our program tonight, we're able to achieve so much more. So I think that that's very important, and there's many ways that people can connect with those issues, whether it's becoming a member, volunteering, citizen science projects, and other strategic partnerships. So I want to just get everyone oriented to our forests, fields, open spaces in Maine. So this map is the trail map for the Kennebunk Land Trust. You'll see a variety of different open space preserves here throughout Kennebunk. There's actually quite a bit located downtown, which is rather interesting. One of our most unique properties that has a very interesting forest on it. We have lots of forested land, but one that I think is very educational and interesting is our Alewife Woods Preserve, which is 625 acres located out in West Kennebunk. And I'll touch a little bit more upon that later, but there's a variety of different open spaces here, Rachel Carson, Kennebunk Plains, and the Land Trust properties there. So just to get everyone oriented of what's around here locally. So I want to dive in a little bit more to forests and Southern Maine forests and forest disturbances before talking a little bit about carbon sequestration. And so with Southern Maine forests and disturbances to forests, we find in Maine, and at least in this part of the state, in Southern Maine, that most of our forests here in this part of the state are comprised of oak and pine forests, mostly red oak, white pine, red maple. You will see also some hemlock and ash as well. That's not a hard, fast rule. That's just sort of a generally what we see here in this part of the state. The other thing I think which is important when we're thinking about forests is what impacts a forest. There's many different things that could cause disturbances to the forest. A couple that I think are interesting to highlight are fire, stumps, beavers, and blowdowns. And so just a couple of things here. A great example I found in Kennebunk is looking at the impacts of, we'll say, the 1947 fire that came through all across Maine, and how that's, created the Kennebunk Plains and has impacted a lot of our forests throughout this part of the state. If you look at Alewife Woods, which I highlighted in the map earlier, that the beginning of that property, if you walk it, you'll see a red pine plantation. It's really beautiful property. And that was replanted by the Civilian Conservation Corps shortly after, in the late 40s, I think, after the 47 fire. And so you'll see red pine there. And as you get closer to the pond, you'll see that forest change to be comprised of more of your species that are more, that you'll find closer to wetter climates, closer to where you see the pond. But as you walk through that red pine plantation, you will see some trees there that actually have fire scars from when the fire came through there. And so you'll really see forest as a way to impact, fires as a way to impact the forest, whether it's helping with regrowth, regeneration, and different ages of those trees. So there's a lot of things that can impact the forest. Beavers are really an interesting topic, where if you have a beaver pond, beaver dam, or lodge near your forest, you may find that beavers, their nutrients that they need, they'll find a lot of protein in trees that are like aspens, maples, alders. So you might see that those are the types of trees that you'll see near beaver ponds. And you might even see, if once those are gone, you might even see signs of beavers actually coring out trees that are more like your conifers, or things that provide less protein for the beaver, because he wants those trees to die and create more space for the trees that have greater protein. So there's a lot of different impacts to a forest, especially in this part of the state. Those aren't all of them, but it's a couple of the unique things that I think help set the stage for why our forests look a certain way, and and also how they contribute to a lot of the benefits that come with our forests. So with that, I just want to highlight a few of the benefits of forests. There are so many. I've found a lot of people lately are enjoying getting outside and seeing the health, wellness, social and emotional benefits of being outside in the forest. But I'm going to highlight here some of your more statistical, fact, quantitative kind of benefits. But certainly we've all been experiencing, or many of us have been experiencing, the qualitative benefits of forests. But forests cover 89% of Maine. That's according to the Department of Agriculture and Conservation. I think that statistic might be a little bit old. I think it's a 2017 fact, but they're cover quite a bit of the state, and the state of Maine is a large state. So they're quite present in this part of the world and throughout the state of Maine here. When we talk about carbon sequestration, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot when we're thinking about climate change. I just want to make sure people are aware of what it means. And one definition that I found was carbon dioxide is taken up by trees through photosynthesis, and it's stored as carbon in biomass. So in your trees, in your tree trunks and your stumps and things like that, the sink of carbon sequestration in a forest helps it offset the sources of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So things that might cause that would be deforestation, fossil fuel emissions, those sort of things. So when we're talking about that carbon sequestration, that's what we're sort of referring to, that exchange of carbon there. And that's a big help in combating a lot of the impacts of climate change. And then one thing I thought was really interesting that I found is each year Maine's forests sequester an amount of carbon that's equal to 60% of the state's annual carbon emissions. So if we take this past year or this year coming up, our forests here in the state will be able to sequester the amount of carbon of 60% of what we've emitted here in the state, which is pretty impressive, I think, for our forests here. So that's something to keep in mind. Certainly, as a land trust, we think of the importance of keeping open spaces, forests, and fields here, especially as we see development increasing in places like Portland and Westbrook and Biddeford and all these places that are putting more pressure in the Kennebunk area. In our case, we see that there's so much more importance to protecting those open spaces, and forests are a central part of that protection. The other piece that I wanted to highlight is that forests are so important for wildlife habitat. I think that's also a big part of climate change when you're looking at how temperatures are changing. We see each year now, colder months and warmer months and all of those sort of things. And if we think about forests, I think that plays a key role in wildlife habitat. And in Maine, and at least in Southern Maine here, a lot of people have used this term that forests are considered baby bird factories. And when I had gone to a talk and I heard this, I thought it was a great simple way to explain it, where we have over 90 species I feel I've heard most recently can be spotted in Maine. And a lot of those species, certain warblers and things, are traveling here, migrating here during different seasons. And our forests, they provide key habitat, whether it's nutrients, shelter, all of those sort of things. So they're very important for us, not only for the carbon sequestering, but also for the habitat factors of things. So that's a quick rundown. I wanted to also just provide some helpful resources. So I wanted to thank everyone here for joining us and for our partners as well. If you're interested in learning more specifics about forests, whether it's deciduous trees, conifers, please check out Forestries of Maine. It's a great resource for the Department of Ag. Reading New England Forest Landscape, that's a great book that highlights forests throughout New England and shares a lot about, dives really deep into the disturbances that I spoke about. Maine Audubon has a great program for forestry for Maine birds, the Nature Conservancy, and of course your local land trusts and statewide land trusts like Maine Farmland Trust. So thank you so much. I hope I didn't run too far over. So I want to thank everyone for their support. And if you have any more questions about forests, we have a forester on our board who is quite more experienced in forests than I am myself. So happy to answer any questions or pass them on to him. I'm going to stop the share.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so informative. I'm going to ask Tom. I don't think I see any questions currently, but I think at the end we're going to have a Q&A as well.
Now, one thing I would just mention, I just encourage the audience to scroll through the chat to make sure that you get down any information, any resources that might be embedded in there so that you don't want to miss it at the end.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Okay, so next up we have Jen Shack. She's the next presenter. Jen is the Kennebunk Conservation Commission Chair. The Conservation Commission has worked with the Select Board to establish a town policy that states that there should be no use of synthetic pesticides on town property except under special conditions. The Commission is also undertaking efforts to educate the community about the impact of synthetic pesticides on the environment, the community, and people's health. Welcome, Jen. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Planeteers, for putting on this event and inviting me to join you with this. I am going to share my screen right now. And why is what I need not there? Sorry about this. Let me try this again. There we go. Great. Okay, so Jen highlighted for you a couple of things that the Conservation Commission is doing in regards to pesticides. I'm pretty much changing the subject a little bit from what everybody else has been talking about. And I'm going to talk about pesticides and why you should not be using them, pretty much. So first things first, when I talk about pesticides, I'm talking about anything that kills something that you don't want. So it's weed killers, anything that kills insects, kills fungus, anything like that. And pretty much when I'm talking about pesticides in this very brief presentation, I'm talking about weed killers for the most part. Pesticide use has massively increased in Maine from 1995 to 2011, the last year that we have any good records. Pesticide sales increased 700%. The other thing we know is that homeowners overuse pesticides. In one study, homeowners were using 3 times as much pesticides as farmers would use on their fields when they applied synthetics. So understanding that you know, we have pesticides all around us right now, and it's gone up dramatically in the last couple of decades. It's important to understand what kind of effects having synthetic pesticides on in your yard and your lawn, in your garden, can have on water, wildlife, and health. So anything that you put on your lawn, in your garden, can end up in our groundwater and in our drinking water. Studies have shown that there are pesticides in drinking water throughout the country. I'm sure that we would probably have the same thing here in some places. Studies have also found pesticides in our groundwater. The Friends of Casco Bay have found pesticides in all of their samples, or many of their samples in Casco Bay. And I want to point out that in Kennebunk, we have the Kennebunk River. So it's very important to understand that, what goes onto our lawns and in our, that can run off into the Kennebunk River if you're in the watershed there. That actually not only causes issues with the river, but anything that is in that river goes out in the ocean and the current pulls it back into Gooch's Beach. So what's in the river is on our beach as well. The effects on wildlife are not just direct effects of ingesting pesticides, but also indirect, because a chemical lawn, for example, is a very sterile environment. It tends to decrease the biome in such a way that insects decrease. And when insects decrease, we also lose the ability for birds to feed their young. Here in Maine, birds primarily feed young caterpillars, and we're having a decline in both moths and butterflies here, as well as bees. And then finally, the biggest thing for me is what effect it has on the health. There are numerous studies that show that there is a connection between pesticides and leukemia, brain tumors, birth defects, learning disabilities, and all of those things, and asthma in children. And all of that is much more enhanced in children and in pets than it is in adults. There are also studies that show that when you have pesticides on your lawn, and your pets can, your kids can, and you can bring those pesticides into your home, where studies have shown it can remain on your surfaces in your home for up to 7 days. So it's not just outside your home, but you're bringing it in and you're living with it inside your home when you apply pesticides to your yard. So I cannot go into everything that you can do to go organic in a very short amount of time that I have to present, but going organic really means ending the chemical addiction. If we're talking lawns, your lawn becomes completely addicted to chemicals. There's nothing else there to help it to thrive. So you need to continually add chemicals in order to make it look healthy. It isn't really healthy, it just looks healthy. And going organic doesn't mean going from synthetic pesticides to organic pesticides, although that is better. It's really thinking about how to use nature to help your lawn and your garden to thrive. So very briefly, some examples are keep your lawn mowed high, 3 inches, instead of cutting it short. That allows the roots to go down further, and you'll have a healthier root system, and you'll need fewer water inputs. When you do mow your lawn, leaving the clippings on the lawn to fertilize it, and then using integrated pest management if you have other insect issues, such as using nematodes for grubs rather than going out and getting grub killer. It also doesn't mean necessarily that you don't use pesticides at all. It just means that you can use it very sparingly. So for example, if you have, like I do, with bittersweet running rampant in your yard and you're constantly fighting it, yeah, you can cut it down and then apply paint on a vine killer, for example. Or if you've got a little problem area in your lawn and you just want to get rid of that little problem area, that's okay. It's just the broad application of pesticides that's really, really problematic. And so that is it. I am being very quick today. I do want to point out, for more information, yardscaping.org is a website that was put together by the state of Maine. It has everything you would ever want to know about how to have a healthy yard. Highly, highly recommended. Tons of resources there. And then beyondpesticides.org has more information about the effects of pesticides on everything. So that's it. Stop my share.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen.
Andrea has a question for Jen. How best to get our local governments to restrict pesticide use?
That's a really good question. The Conservation Commission has looked into an ordinance, such as ones that are in place now in Algonquin, South Portland, Portland, that would ban the use of pesticides. We decided at the time, and I think I still agree with this, that it's not really an enforceable. There's not going to be anyone. Yes, I agree with you, Lisa. I will talk with you about that in a second. So what am I saying? It's not enforceable. So who's going to go around and check to make sure that individual homeowners are not putting pesticides on their lawn? So we believe that the first step is really doing something like what I'm trying to do here, although I think I am probably preaching to the choir, which is to educate people about the reasons why pesticide use is harmful to our community. We do have a pesticide policy for town property, as Jen mentioned when she introduced me, which the town is not supposed to apply pesticides to town property unless there's some big emergency. So I guess the long answer to Andrea is basically, I think it's a long process to do it right. And we need to start with education, and then we need to get more of a grassroots level effort going to get more people on board before we bring it to the select board.
Thank you.
Yep. And then there was another one from Lisa.
Yes.
I do not know, Lisa. I see the signs and we need to be going back and talking to the town.
So the question that Lisa asked was that she often sees pesticide signs on the walks by the sidewalk on her walks through town. And she was just wondering if Jen knew what they're putting on their flower beds. So.
Okay.
Great, Jen. Thank you so much for being here and sharing that information. We so appreciate it. Next up, our next presenter, we have Jesselyn Benson. As wildlife habitat biological technician at Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, Jesselyn Benson helps protect native and vulnerable species by managing invasive plants, restoring habitat, especially for New England cottontail, having fun with habitat management, working with locals who want to improve their wildlife contributions, and coordinating the refuge's year-long 50th anniversary celebration. Welcome, Jesselyn.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Everybody has had a really interesting presentation so far, so I'm glad to be here. I will start sharing my screen. Is that all good? All right. So we do, here at the refuge, we do a whole number of wildlife habitat management projects, but one of the big ones is invasive plant species work. So I'm just gonna do a quick overview of that. So first of all, in order to kind of have an idea of why we're bothering with tackling these big removal processes or trying to get rid of some invasive plants as opposed to others, is to know why they are detrimental. So basically, an invasive plant is a non-native plant that outcompetes native plants for resources. So they're plants that have come over from a different place where they are not acting as an invasive plant. They have their own niche there, but once they come over to an area like Southern Maine, which hasn't had them in the past, they kind of fill in this empty niche and are able to disrupt ecosystems and outcompete native plants. And they're just not as beneficial for native wildlife in general. And they can really edge out native plants, as seen in this picture here. This is a bunch of garlic mustard in an actual rare plant site. So that's not good. So we try to take care of them as much as we can. So what we do first is prioritize which ones we're going to tackle. And that really is on the basis of which areas on the refuge are the most vulnerable. Are there endangered species around? Or is it an early detection species, as we call it, which means there's only a few spots in southern Maine that it's been detected, so we can kind of whack them out before it gets too bad. And then we survey and map everything to make sure we know where everything is. Then we do treatment, which is usually removal or cutting, things like that. And then disposal, making sure that we're not creating new problems in landfills or other places. And then we just keep an eye on it and kind of keep adapting. If something didn't work one year, we'll go back the next year and do it a different way. So one of the big ones right now, especially, is garlic mustard, which is coming up now. You may be starting to see this around town. So this one, it has a very strong garlicky smell, and you can actually make things like pesto out of it. I like to do like half basil, half pesto, half garlic mustard. But so really, as you can see in this, as you can see in the bottom picture here, it can really just like completely take over a forest understory, and just wipe out any native plants that are there, like the ones that we like pink lady slipper and things like that. And it can often be found in areas where yard waste has been dumped. So that top right picture is shown just like a hotbed of invasives that have grown over yard waste, and it really makes the garlic mustard just grow up that much faster. Yellow flag iris is another big one that really can take over ecosystems. As you can kind of tell in these pictures, it's altering the habitats that they start to invade, and that's not good for native species of frogs, amphibians, turtles, things like that. And it can really take over people's yards, as you can see in this pond in somebody's backyard. So for this one, a lot of what we do is, sorry, I don't know if you're seeing that thing up top, but hopefully you don't. Okay, so it's a pretty large plant, and what we have to do is really dig the whole thing out. So it can spread by seeds, it can travel for miles in a river and then deposit seeds. But it also spreads by the roots and rhizomes. So we really got to dig it up until it's all gone and dispose of it in an incinerator. So it's a tricky one. So if you have a plant that kind of looks like this, but it doesn't have the yellow flowers, it has purple flowers, that's probably blue flag iris, which is a good native plant, but it can be a little tricky to identify. So you always got to make sure that you're correctly identifying, so we're not taking out good plants. Another one is black swallowwort, and this is another one, like you can see in that bottom picture, can really take over, strangle out trees similar to bittersweet. But the main sticking point with this one is that monarch butterflies will lay their eggs on the leaves thinking it's milkweed, and then the caterpillars hatch and they can't sustain themselves on it and they die. So not a fun one. Another one is perennial pepperweed, which is one of our early detection species, which means we've only seen it in a couple areas in Maine so far. So this is like one of those really important ones to keep an eye out. Everyone can keep an eye out because it's mostly around, like in the dunes around beaches, but it can also be found along the highway. And we're thinking maybe it can be deposited by, seeds being picked up on tires and something like that. So hoping to keep a damper on this one. So Phragmites is another one that we kind of keep an eye on, but you'll kind of see it all over the marsh in places. So we target which areas we're gonna take care of it in, like say in a critical area, and then we're doing some studies for control as well. And then of course we have all the other invasives that we either do in specific areas or we do when we have time, like bittersweet, which is that giant vine or giant root system that our intern is holding up, or Japanese knotweed, like on the right there. So one way you can get involved if you're interested is come and pull plants with us, volunteer. We are going to be doing garlic mustard pullings. We call them, whenever we do an invasive pulling, we call them invasive pulling parties. So it's a lot of fun. We'll be out in Cuts Island and Kittery Point on April 27th, May 7th, and May 14th, and potentially other times. But there are so many other opportunities at other organizations as well. So in this area, Southern Maine, New Hampshire, throughout New England. So just keep an eye out for things like that. You can look on Nature Groupie. They have a lot of events. You can just type in invasives in the search bar and get an event pretty quickly. You can join things like the Garlic Mustard Challenge and just pull in your backyard or wherever you see it and report that. A little bit of a citizen science. You can also download the IMAP Invasives map or app or website and report that way. And just be mindful in general. If you see a plant that you know is on the Maine state list of invasives that are banned from sale now, if you see it online, maybe check to see if it's invasive before you buy it, because not all plants are regulated in that way, especially online. So just be mindful, check around your yard, see if you have anything, and have fun with it. Just go out there with your app or an identification book and see what you can find. And then always, if you have any questions, you can always contact me or your other local organizations, because we're always happy to help out with identification or best practices for removal, things like that. So I will put these links in the chat for you guys, so you can have them to look at your leisure. But otherwise, thank you guys for listening, and I look forward to having a little discussion.
Jesselyn, Sarah Stanley's asking, how often do you go in to remove species like bittersweet?
So bittersweet is kind of a weird one because we, so bittersweet is one of those ones where we kind of just concentrate on specific areas because that one is already so taken over in a lot of places that we really just have to focus on, say, if it's crowding out rare plants, say like beach plum on the refuge, we'll definitely tackle those. If there's some other areas like on our Timber Point Island Trail, we'll tackle that because we don't want it to get out of hand. And then, yeah, so that's basically kind of whenever we have time throughout the year, because that's one of those ones you can kind of treat almost any time of the year, but usually in the fall, we really hit it pretty good.
Thank you.
I see there's one more question that just came up for Jesselyn. One of our Planeteers asks, I heard we have native strawberry plants that can compete with knotweed. Is that true?
I haven't heard that necessarily with, I don't think I've heard of that with knotweed. It's possible, but I just don't know. I'm actually curious now. I'm going to look into that. I feel like that would be something, if it did, it would be because of the chemical composition, probably, because the knotweed is such an aggressive invasive, and it really has like this strong root system, and it kind of just, I don't know if you've ever seen a dense patch of knotweed, but there's really nothing growing underneath them. So I would assume that the reason for that would be something to do with the chemical composition that the strawberry plants release. So I'd like to look into that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for all the great information.
Thank you.
And next up tonight, we have Anna Fielkoff. She is the program manager for Wild Seed Project. She enjoys educating people about native plants and ecological gardening. She was previously senior horticulturist for Native Plant Trust in Massachusetts and hosts a BA in human ecology from College of the Atlantic and an MS in ecological design from the Conway School. Anna urges you to pledge to rewild. Hi, Anna. Thanks for being here.
Hello, thanks for having me. And thank you both to the Kennebunk Free Library and the Planeteers for hosting such a wonderful group of organizations and individuals tonight. I'm happy to participate. So I work at Wild Seed Project, as you just heard, and we are a young but growing nonprofit in Portland. And we educate the public about restoring native plants in their landscapes, both to bring back biodiversity and to make our landscapes more resilient and adaptable in the face of climate change. So this is a really great topic to jump into, really concentrating on lawns and fields and meadows and how they can help with both of those things. So recently, Wild Seed Project launched a campaign called Rewilding, or the Pledge to Rewild. And that's basically giving people a framework through which to understand how to restore native plants to their own landscapes, whether that be in rural areas, suburban areas, or somewhere in between. And it's not just for homeowners, it can be for businesses, commercial landscapes, the public landscapes, and municipal landscapes, all of those included, farmlands as well. So rewilding begins with recognizing native plants as the basis of our local food web. And we've gained a lot of our inspiration from the work of Doug Tallamy, who is an entomologist and a biologist at the University of Delaware. And he's written a number of really wonderful books that, if you're interested in native plants and their relationship to insects, I recommend that you check them out. This is a go-to book. This is his second most recent book, Bringing Nature's Best Hope. Bringing Nature Home is a book that I think really got him into the native plant world. It got people really thinking about why native plants are so important for our ecosystems. And then he recently came out with his latest book, literally just came out, is The Nature of Oaks. And he talks about how oaks are really significant native plants in our ecosystems as well. So this is because, one person's already touched upon this, but native plants have such a close interconnected relationship with insects. And we've recently seen that there's kind of an insect Armageddon in process, where we have major declines in our insects. And then in turn, because birds are so dependent on both native plants and insects, major declines in our migrating birds. So native plants especially support those moth and butterfly caterpillars that are really essential to the early stages of when birds are nesting and feeding their young. They provide just a really important protein source, kind of like a miniature sausage. That's perfect protein source for those baby birds in their nests. And so just recognizing that we need to get as many native plants into our landscapes as possible and as much native plant biomass as we can. And I think, as you might have heard already today, lawns are just not really great for the landscape. The suburban and urban matrix make up about half of the US landscape, and a lot of that is lawn, and lawn is often the default in those landscapes. They are really huge resource hogs. They are one of the primary irrigated crops in the US. They require huge amounts of fossil fuels from mowers, pesticide sprays to keep them perfect, and fertilizers that keep them nice and green. And both those pesticides, fertilizers, and the the byproducts from the mowing go into our watersheds and wash into our water bodies and create all sorts of problems. And they're also expensive. So, there's a lot of reason to get rid of lawns and to replace our lawns with as many native plants as we can. We can use lawn alternatives like this sedge lawn. Pennsylvania sedge is a grass-like plant that is actually a plant that hosts a lot of different moth and butterfly caterpillars on its leaves. So it's not a pollinator plant per se, in that it doesn't have flowers that moths and butterflies and bees pollinate, but it does host them in one part of their life cycle, which is really significant. It doesn't require the inputs that traditional lawn does, and it doesn't grow very tall, so it doesn't need to be mowed. And who doesn't want an edible lawn? I know somebody just brought up wild strawberry, and wild strawberries, they contribute both not just a place to walk softly on the ground, but flowers and leaves for those pollinators, and then fruits for us and small mammals to relish. And I don't believe that wild strawberry can really compete against something like Japanese knotweed, but it definitely is what you might consider, it makes its space in the landscape, and it really is a great ground cover for covering, steep slopes or places that really need something on the ground to prevent erosion. And so it's a really great alternative to a lawn, or to be incorporated into a more traditional lawn. Otherwise, I think we need to shrink our lawns. And so instead of letting lawns be that default in the landscape, we can kind of, start by shrinking them in half even. And we can do that by just stopping mowing a good portion of our lawn, letting that nice mowed edge define recreational areas, gathering spaces and pathways that convey us through the landscape, letting the lawns be useful instead of just kind of, making up all of the ornamental space. And instead of lawns, we can convert our lawns, or a good portion of our lawns, to layers. We can really stack, pack, and layer our landscapes with as much native plant biomass as possible, and therefore create more places for water to be intercepted by leaves and infiltrate into the ground and get absorbed like a sponge by this native vegetation. We can plant trees, shrubs, vines, ground layer plants and ground covers that cover every single niche in the landscape, and even containerized plants in small spaces that could hold native shrubs. All of these plants can act as mitigators of climate change by cooling the urban heat island, shading our hot city areas with native trees, and absorbing that extra stormwater runoff, and also being resilient against things like drought and flooding, those extremes that we're experiencing with climate change. So why mow when you can meadow? You can turn your lawn into meadow by releasing the mower. You can more thoughtfully replace your lawn without tilling the ground by, sheet mulching on top of that, and then planting native plants into that sheet mulch. There's so many ways to go about it. And we can rewild our roadsides too. I think I would love to see more political will build towards rewilding our roadsides. We have provided Maine DOT with, and we worked with them on a kind of a guide for restoring native plants to our roadsides and our highway margins. And I would love to spark more interest in that way. We can start just by stopping mowing during the growing season and moving our mowing regimen into the dormant season, say November through early April is probably the better time. And then working on, removing invasive species on the roadsides instead of mowing down the beautiful native plants that we have while they're at their prime and providing lots of pollinator and insect opportunities. And one of my favorite native plants I want to highlight, or group of plants, is goldenrods. There's many, many species of goldenrods, and they have developed a bad reputation, unfortunately. They actually they're thought of as agricultural weeds a lot of the time. I think Canada goldenrod is one of the more aggressive species that does form big colonies, but it's still a really important plant for late season forage of nectar and pollen for bees and wasps. And then goldenrods in general host hundreds of lepidopteran or moth and butterfly caterpillars on their leaves. And then, I would plant Canada goldenrod in a roadside or a large meadow area, whereas there are so many other species of goldenrods that there's one suited for every single type of condition you might have. So for instance, the gray goldenrod is a nice petite goldenrod that doesn't overtop other plants, and it can grow in a nice small sunny garden or meadow, low meadow garden if you like. So plant goldenrods, that's something that I want to plug. And then I encourage everybody to take a look at our Pledge to Rewild. It's free to take our pledge. And it's a way that you can, if you're already, using native plants in your landscape, you can demonstrate your commitment to restoring native plants. You can also, if you're new to this, it's really a great way to get these free tools and resources that give you step-by-step guidance in the form of these 10 actionable steps that you can take towards rewilding your landscape. So please check out everything else we do at Wild Seed Project, including selling seeds of native plants and publishing our annual publication, our information-rich website for how-to resources on native plant gardening and seed sowing. And please join this grassroots movement to restore native plants to our landscape. Thank you.
And Paul Perkins has a question. He's asking about, what about ticks? Do they thrive in thicker native vegetation?
Yeah, that is true. But I think that one thing that we have found actually is that there is a correlation between invasive species like Japanese barberry and the presence of ticks, as well as the increase of deer and the white-footed mouse and the presence of ticks. So there's a little bit more to the story than just thicker vegetation. And I think a lot of it has to do with just the lack of balance that we have in our landscapes. So if we can move towards restoring native plants as much as possible and balancing our landscapes, I think, it's not like necessarily that the tick population will drop, but it's something that, we can encourage more predators that they'll feed on the white-footed mouse and just restore that balance of all the different relationships between the species. Another thing is that, if you have a backyard meadow, for instance, you can mow like a 3-foot wide strip through the meadow, like a meandering path, so that you're not necessarily coming into too close contact with those plants and getting near the ticks. So there's different ways that you can manage that. Yeah. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you for the helpful tips too, with how to rewild our lands. Next, we are going to circle back around to Sarah Simon so she can tell us a little more about Maine Farmland Trust.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks everyone for staying together. I found this so interesting, and I love having this kind of conversation with everything from the backyard to the landscape level, because it's all so important and it needs to be thought about together, whether it's the landscape you manage yourself or the landscape that's managed for you, like farms and forests that we all depend upon but may not be connected with. So I've just had a great time. I hope everyone else has too. Okay, I'm gonna reshare my screen. I love how we all have to kind of go vacant for a second and figure this out. So I'm glad to have the second chance just to talk a little more about Maine Farmland Trust's work. As I mentioned, climate change is a really important focus of our new 5-year strategic plan. And that has a few different objectives in a general way, we want to integrate climate smart practices into our work. So our general approach to land conservation has been to really let farmers take the lead. We haven't wanted to dictate too much about practices. And there was a question earlier, do you work with dairy farms, vegetable farms? Does that factor in? It really doesn't. We believe that all farms have a place in our state, and we try to support them however we can. Yet we recognize the reality of climate change, and we also want to support farms making the transition to more climate-friendly practices. So incentivizing, educating, not forcing, but this is something that we really want to prioritize. And we want to increase the support, both in terms of funding and other resources for farmers using climate smart practices. So that means we do a lot of work on the policy side, and our policy director, Ellen Griswold, has been engaged for a long time in climate change advocacy at the state and federal level. But we also work a lot on working with farmers. In many cases, on similar projects, many farmers are interested in how to integrate native plantings, woodies, moving away from monocultures. But as you can probably imagine, it's hard when you're working on a large scale in a more mechanized way to manage diverse landscapes. So I think that's the challenge we're confronting. And I'm excited to share some ways that I've been able to work on that just in this year. So this is kind of a first sneak peek at some new work that we're doing that I'm really excited about. So first, I'm participating in something called the Climate Adaptation Fellowship, which is a project of the US Department of Agriculture's Northeast Climate Hub. So they have a hub focused on climate change in each region. And in the Northeast, they've brought together teams of service providers, so farmer advisors, consultants with farmers to come up with plans for climate adaptation on their farm. So my partner is Bumbleroot Organic Farm in Windham, who I hope many of you know. They're fantastic. I've been working with Melissa Law, who's one of the 4 owners. And it's been a great process so far. We had a week of learning together, unfortunately by Zoom and not in person, about different ways that farms are both adapting to climate change. So that might mean dealing with increased heavy rainfall by coming up with different soil management plans, but also mitigating climate change. So that could be everything from sequestering more carbon in various ways to getting solar panels and using less fossil fuel generated electricity. So we really covered a broad span of topics. And the way we chose our project was thinking about the worst risks of climate change at her farm. And we ended up identifying the risk of erosion and extreme rainfall events. And so this is a map of her farm. It's really just a starting point. We're going to be creating a whole landscape design or really redesign for her farm. But her land is very sloped, and it was fantastic to work with Bumbleroot because their farm was part of a Buy, Protect, Sell project that Maine Farmland Trust enacted a few years ago. So we purchased this farm. It was at risk of being sold and brought into development as the aging landowner was looking for a transition. We placed an easement and an option to protect at agricultural value on it, so it can only be used for farming and valued at agricultural value in transactions. And then we sold it to this great group of young farmers. Now they wanted to grow vegetables, and this land had been used for livestock and pasture and was quite sloping. And so they've tilled in a few places. You can see this patchwork on the map, and I hope you can see my cursor too, because I'm going to try to point to some things. So we'll see if that works. And they've quite successfully used the fields around their house, which are flatter land, but unfortunately the fields further away are very sloped. There's about a 5 to 7% slope on the fields to the right of the screen. And they have had a lot of erosion and extreme rainfall events. So our proposed solution is going to be contour buffer strips, which will be 15 feet wide, a mix of grass and legumes, probably clover. They'll also have rows of woody perennials that can be used for both cut stem propagation for, just cut stems for cut flowers, which is one of the farm's enterprises, as well as plant propagation for their annual plant sale. So it's a way of both balancing preventing erosion by having more plants, but also giving them the potential to generate income since it has a role in their overall financial business. And in between these strips of perennial buffer crops, they'll be able to cultivate annual crops. And the hope is that the erosion will be mitigated by having more strips of perennials in between. So that's a great project, and we're excited. They're going to be planting that this August, and I'm really looking forward to participating in that and welcoming people to the farm to see what they're doing as well. And this kind of links up with some interesting, I wanted to mention this current bill before the legislature right now, which is LD 437, an act to create the Maine Healthy Soils Program. And this bill would create a program within the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry to connect farmers with resources, including funding and information about soil health. Soil health often means increased carbon in the soils, which means less carbon in the atmosphere. So it has real implications for climate change. The less tillage that's happening, the more cover crops that are on farms. And this bill has been voted ought to pass by the Joint Committee on Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. So my understanding of the process is that at this point, that means that unless someone goes in and says we need to discuss it, essentially vetoes it or speaks out against it, it will go through. And we're really excited to have this new resource for farmers. So it's less of a patchwork when farmers are making changes. And this feeds into another new program that we are launching right now, which is called the Maine Soil Health Network. And this is for our easement holding farms. This year we will have 10 farms involved, 8 for-profit farms and 2 nonprofits. And the purpose is to create a cohort of farmers who are learning together about their soils, about their soil health, and the impacts of their management practices in a group, to ask each other questions, to brainstorm about changes, and to have support. And I'm excited that we have some regional and national partners for this, because I think it's so important to learn. We're all confronting this challenge at the same time. And as part of those partnerships, we'll be working with a group in Pennsylvania, the PASA Sustainable Agriculture Group, and participating in their soil health benchmark study, which they've been running for 5 years now. It involves the farms benchmarking their soil health through soil tests, as well as their management practices against other farms with similar crop types, so they can see, oh, we're actually tilling less than everyone, and as a result, our organic matter is higher than average, or the opposite. They can see where they stack up, as well as comparing their farm this year to their farm in 2 years, so they can see over several years the impacts of their practices. So we're very excited to be part of that and to have the connection with farmers in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And then we're also working with the Wolf's Neck Center in Freeport and their national open team network, which is working on open source farm software to allow farmers to keep track and measure their soil health. So it's great to have these partners, because this is a bigger initiative than even just Maine, and it's important to be thinking about these things regionally, nationally. And we're going to have a launch event. It'll be in June. I'm not going to share the farm name just yet because we haven't confirmed every detail. But if you'd like to sign up for our e-news, you can hear about that event. We are just getting back, like so many, to doing on-farm events this summer, and they're going to be smaller. So if you see the announcement and you want to come, just sign up quickly, as there will be limited spots. But I'll just end by saying I'm really thrilled that we're taking steps to do more to incentivize better soil health and climate change mitigating practices. And I think it is so important to do this at every scale, from very small, where you can really have the biodiversity of plants and manage things more intensively, all the way to the really large farms where so much of our nation's food and even our fuel and all kinds of products come from. So I will wrap up there. This has been so wonderful to be part of, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I don't have
Tom,
a question, Sarah, but I'm just really encouraged to hear that news about LD 437. I was hoping that it would be supported, so it's good to hear.
I don't know that we have any other questions currently, but I just wanted to take a hot second to thank all of the presenters so much for being here tonight. You guys are doing impressive work, and I'm just so inspired to hear all of you, and thank you for sharing all your fabulous information and to Allison and everyone at the library, thanks for partnering with us. We so appreciate this. And all of you who attended tonight, I hope that you got something out of the evening and that you can join us in the future. We have every Tuesday night at 6, pretty much. The next month, we're going to have a different section of the Maine climate plan that we're going to tackle and get information from local folks. So thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.
Yes,
Have a
I'm
great night.
copying and pasting the whole chat because there's so much information for me to access later.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Nice meeting you guys. Great job.